evening. I'm Bill Roper, and it's my distinct honor and privilege to welcome you to this annual Norma Berryhill Distinguished Lecture. It's a beautiful fall afternoon here in Chapel Hill. We have much to be grateful for, and this annual celebration of the medical school, its history and its future, is something that I look forward to each year, and I'm pleased to welcome you. We have a number of distinguished guests. I'd like to recognize Chancellor Meeser and Susan Meeser, Chancellor Harden, Barbara Harden, Dean Bondurant, and Susan Eringhouse, a number of people that are here. Thank you all for coming, many friends of Jeff's and family members. This annual event has always been a high point for the School of Medicine community. It is indeed our fall convocation. It represents the start of our academic year, and it reaffirms our commitment to scholarship, to students, to faculty, and to the collegiality that the Berryhills left as a legacy to this institution. As many of you know, this lectureship recognizes a highly cherished individual, Norma Berryhill, who, along with her distinguished husband, Dr. Reese Berryhill, contributed immeasurably to the development of this institution, to the recruitment of an outstanding faculty, and to the enhancement of the collegial ambiance that characterizes Chapel Hill. Indeed, Norma and Reese Berryhill hold an exalted place in our School of Medicine's history. Dr. Berryhill, for his monumental accomplishments as medical school dean from 1940 to 1964, which includes the expansion of the medical school and the building of the North Carolina Memorial Hospital, and Norma Berryhill, his partner of 48 years, for her love, loyalty, quiet wisdom, strength, and support. For more than 65 years, Norma Berryhill was, as someone called it, a principal architect and engineer for the School of Medicine and this medical center, having nurtured generations of students and provided guiding wisdom to faculty and to all the deans. For this, we are tremendously grateful. Please join me in offering our gratitude for all the Berryhills have done for us. And I want to acknowledge the presence of the Berryhill family, Catherine Williams, their daughter, and Jane and David Meyer. Jane is their granddaughter, and David is her husband. We're glad to have you all with us. Dr. Charles Sanders asked me to bring to you his greetings. He was to have spoken this evening, but had to be out of town. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chip McAllister, who is the president of the Medical Alumni Association. Dr. McAllister wears a number of hats. He is an alum of this school. He is a major supporter and donor for things that we're undertaking in a variety of areas, but particularly in the heart and cardiology area. Dr. McAllister has told me many times a thing that he's particularly proud of, and Chip, I would say we are proud of this as well. I think he is the only father-son team. His dad was president of the Medical Alumni Association at this school, and Chip is now our president. So Chip, we're glad to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Dean Roper. I'd heard wonderful things about Dr. and Mrs. Berryhill from my parents' dinner conversations while I was growing up in Lumberton. However, I only came to know them personally when I entered medical school at UNC in 1961. I then became very much aware that Dr. Berryhill was Dean Berryhill. With the time-consuming vigors of medical school, I had very few opportunities to meet Mrs. Berryhill, but we all knew, all of my classmates, all of us knew of her kindness. She would often give pre-football game luncheons at their home, from medical alumni and other friends of the university and medical school. She also entertained wives of students, residents, and faculty at their home on a regular basis. Dean Berryhill was a remarkable gentleman who taught and led by example with strong conviction. In the early 50s, he fought to establish the four-year medical school in Chapel Hill on the university campus with success. He recruited one of the most outstanding group of department chairs in the history of our country, yet patients were few and beds were fewer. True austerity. Dean Berryhill approached solving this problem by molding administration, faculty, and alumni into one working unit. Although this innovation took place in every department, the one that I knew best was the Department of OBGYN. When Dr. Robert A. Ross, one of the most sought-after chairs of OBGYN in the country, approached Dean Berryhill with the question, how do I recruit faculty and residents when we have so few patients and fewer beds? Dr. Berryhill replied, we both have a friend who is a UNC alumnus living in Lumberton. He has a large practice composed mainly of indigent patients, many of whom have received no prenatal care, and many of whom have a variety of complications. Let's give Hugh McAllister a call. I'm sure that it'll help us. So that for the first few years of the medical education of residents and medical students, they supplemented their training in OBGYN at Lumberton. From this austere beginning in the early 50s, the department has become one of the most highly regarded departments of OBGYN in the world, as have most of the departments in our medical school. Thus, by molding the approval and support of the administration with the time, toil, and talent of the faculty, and with the patient base and loyalty of the alumni, Dean Berryhill guided our medical school from austerity to the prosperity that we have enjoyed for many years. Remembering him as a man who taught and led by example, and allowing him to continue to teach and lead us, we only need to follow this example of molding administration, faculty, and alumni together to move out of the financial austerity of today and into the prosperity of mind and spirit that will make us even stronger to accomplish his wish of bettering the health of the people. I have no doubt that we can and will accomplish this goal. After all, we are Tar Heels. God bless.
Thank you, Dr. McAllister. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 2009 Norma Berryhill Distinguished Lecturer, my good friend, Dr. Jeffrey L. Houpt. After receiving his undergraduate degree from Wheaton College and his medical degree from Baylor College of Medicine, Jeff served a medical internship at Boston City Hospital and a psychiatry residency at Yale. He then served at the United States Naval Station in Oakland, California, and the Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco. Upon completing his military duty, Jeff turned toward academic medicine, holding positions first at Duke University and then Emory University, where he was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry and then dean of the School of Medicine. He's credited with developing new clinical and research programs there to address changes in the field and doubling the amount of federal research funding at Emory, which in turn improved the school's rank from 38th to 20th among the accredited U.S. medical schools. In 1997, UNC was fortunate to convince Jeff to come to Carolina to be dean of this School of Medicine and vice chancellor for medical affairs. 1 year later, in 1998, he added the title of CEO of the UNC healthcare system, which was created that year. As dean, he recruited 23 chairs and center directors, and he grew the faculty from 981 to 1,370. We each can thank Jeff for his key role in many of the buildings you see on our health sciences campus today. The Neurosciences Research Building, the Bioinformatics Building, the Medical Biomolecular Research Building, the Genetic Medicine Building, the Biomedical Research Imaging Center, and the North Carolina Cancer Hospital. It was through his efforts and his relationships with local and state leaders that many of these buildings were conceived and funded, buildings which enable both clinical and basic scientists to interact. I mentioned earlier that Jeff was the first CEO of the UNC healthcare system. Under his tenure, UNC purchased Rex Healthcare and opened both the North Carolina Women's Hospital and the North Carolina Children's Hospital, facilities which help us to provide excellent care throughout our state. Beyond his influence at UNC, Jeff is very well respected within the national field of psychiatry. He's edited scientific journals and authored numerous articles and books, and earned a variety of awards and served on national committees, as well as serving as president of the American College of Psychiatrists. One of Jeff's most important contributions is helping others succeed, and he's now passing his leadership skills on to others here at UNC through the program in leadership development, which he leads. Finally, let me add a personal note, if I might. In the spring of 1997, Jeff was being recruited here to Carolina to be dean of the medical school, and I was being recruited to be dean of the School of Public Health. Jeff and I had met and gotten to know each other in Atlanta, he at Emory and I at the CDC, and we got in touch with each other that spring and actually had dinner with each other in Washington in March of that year and talked through how it might work out were we both to come here. As it happened, we did. I say for myself, happily it worked out. And so across Jeff's extraordinarily successful deanship, I was able to watch across the street from the School of Public Health to learn from you, Jeff, and had the great good fortune to be your successor. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and distinguished predecessor, Dr. Jeffrey Houpt. Jeff?
Bill, thank you very much for that. You're more than generous always in introducing me and attributing to me things that I didn't even do and some things I had a part of a role in, but I will accept all of them. Whenever I hear Bill talk about me, I wish my mother were still alive and she could hear it. This is going to be a typical Houpt presentation, too many slides for the amount of time. So I have a deal with Alan Stiles in the back. And that is, if I'm going on too long, he's going to stand up and clap. You're all to follow and clap. I'll bow. We'll pretend it's over, and we'll get on to the next part, okay? In the meantime, any of you who are subject to epilepsy, be careful of photic stimulation as we fly through these slides, okay? I'll do my best. It is a great honor to be asked to give the Berryhill Lecture. It honors a woman who has earned the respect of all of us. If Reese Berryhill was the architect of the four-year school and the creator of the hospital, Norma was the guiding force who championed a sense of community, warmth, and civility that has long characterized this great school. In fact, we find in these opening moments of the school the two features on which I wish to focus today. One, the creation of a school whose explicit mission is to serve the people of the state, and two, the historic tradition of the school to value a sense of collegiality and the ability to work together. These commitments to mission and to community have distinguished UNC from its Berryhill beginnings. But are they relevant in our current highly commoditized, mercantile environment? Or are they simply a historic beginning, however idealistic, to a new set of realities? And so that's where we're heading. We're going to review the current realities. I'm going to give a short history of the financial support of academic health centers, review the history of the mission of our school and our sense of community, and then close with some closing comments so you can keep track as to how we're moving along. A new set of realities. In labor and delivery, an uninsured patient is successfully delivered, and just a few doors down, a VIP is successfully cardioverted. A hospital has no available beds, and family members in the ER continue to ask, when will my mother be admitted? And ER physicians grumble, when will the Hillsborough facility be completed? Andrew Gagani is back in his office after a full day in the clinic. He's trying to decide if he should return his calls to his patients first or fill out all of his insurance requests for justification of tests that he's ordered. As he's about to make that decision, one of his general medicine colleagues puts his head in the door and says, "Having a good time yet?" And then adds sarcastically, "Just like the good old days, huh?" Meanwhile, Todd Peterson has just finished a session with Gary Park. They're going to announce tomorrow another 3.5% reduction to all budgets. Just another day in the office for them, but sure to bring protests from the chairs. Meanwhile, a news flash interrupts all television programs in the area to announce of a fire in an industrial plant outside Fayetteville, with at least 15 people being helicoptered to the UNC Burn Center. Bruce Cairns and other clinicians can plan for an all-nighter. Not the residents, though. They're protected by an 80-hour work week. How do we get to easier work conditions for residents and faculty? Bill Roper has just finished dinner and tells Mary Ann that our uncompensated care just rose to $269 million this year. Tony Meyer is finishing a meeting with his most productive clinical surgeons who are unhappy with their pay. They want their compensation to match their productivity. Why be paid at the 25th percentile when you meet the 75th percentile standards for productivity? Donald Spencer is reviewing the details of an agreement with IBM to create a huge data warehouse on diabetes. While it has great potential, clinical significance, it has great economic upside as well. Rick Boucher. He is returning to his office to find the results of a new compound's effect on cystic fibrosis, the most promising thus far. He's been down this road before, but maybe, just maybe, this time. Etta Pisano is working intensely to create an accelerated process for product discovery that would bring UNC in step with other academic leaders who have forged ties with industry and perhaps move us to the fore. Meanwhile, the larger community of faculty is less sure of all these industrial relationships. Jerome Cassirer's book, Doctors on the Take, keeps flying off the shelf in the bookstore. The Runge Committee on Conflict of Interest remains in deliberation. Many faculty are acutely aware of Grassley's brutal attacks on several of the nation's most prominent psychiatrists and their alleged large payments from industry. In Washington, Barack Obama is reviewing the day with Michelle and frankly expressing concerns whether the compromises needed are worth the squeeze. In an effort to bring the pharmaceutical industry, hospitals, physicians, and insurance industry in line, he has made many concessions. You know, Michelle, he says, there are just too many people making money off of health care to bring them all in line. Max Baucus is huddled with Olympia Snow to see if they can make the numbers work. Can they legislate medical loss ratios and the percent of people needed to be covered in a state to make sure that insurance companies meet their social obligations? And meanwhile, influence peddling continues. Alonzo Cantu, the founder of the doctors' hospitals at Renaissance, and a heavy contributor to both political parties, has just hung the phone after being reassured by the Speaker of the House and key members of the Senate Finance Committee that they would not limit majority ownership of hospitals by physicians. You will recall that this hospital was featured in the June issue of The New Yorker, which posited that the physicians overordered tests and procedures because they got both fees and a share of hospital profits. What are we to think of all of this? Every episode above plays out on the balance sheet, either of the medical school or of the nation. Everyone from Chapel Hill could be viewed as a potential point of conflict as well, between and among faculty and industry or between faculty and the administration. And everyone in Washington, an example of distrust between the parties and a classic conflict of self-interest versus the public good. Is it conceivable in any way that the Chapel Hill experiences could be viewed as consistent with the grand mission envisioned by Reese and the concept of community espoused by Norma? And is there an antidote to the self-interest that we see in Washington? These are the realities. Let's begin to answer that by asking how we got there and a short history of academic health centers. I think most analysts would agree that the two seminal events that have been responsible for developing the character of the academic health center are the Flexner report in 1911 and the expansion of the NIH in 1940. This is Flexner, and this is the report that he made to the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. As you know, Flexner visited almost 150 schools and determined that many were inadequate and that many should be shut down. He made several suggestions for reforms, including affiliations with universities, basic science divisions, full-time clinical teachers, and declared Johns Hopkins the model for a U.S. medical school. Interestingly, when he gave his report to Andrew Carnegie, who asked him to create the report, Carnegie responded to Flexner, "You have proved that medical education is a business. I will not endow any other man's business." And Flexner put the report on the shelf. However, the Rockefeller Foundation picked the report up and initially funded WashU, Vanderbilt, Yale, Chicago to become in the Hopkins mold, and later 4 public schools, Colorado, Virginia, Oregon, and Georgia. Education became the coin of the realm, and the model at Hopkins became the model that all espoused. If you read of our history and the recruitment of the first set of chairs that Chip mentioned earlier, the Duke Dean commented that it was as fine a group of chairs, even as good as at Hopkins. So Hopkins' influence was present here from its very beginning. In 1940, the United States government decided to expand the NIH and provided an enormous amount of funding for research. I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I think you all know its effect. But the important point is that research then became the coin of the realm. It became the way we defined how we were good, if we were good, and how we ranked among others. You can look today just at the rankings of NIH funding and put them next to the so-called best in U.S. News and World Report, and there's very much of an overlap between the two. The point of this is that both Flexner, through Carnegie and then Rockefeller, and the NIH provided funds which U.S. medical schools readily accepted, and in accepting those funds dramatically changed the way we do business and the way we evaluated ourselves. We now move on to financial stimuli. In contrast to the NIH and in contrast to Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Flexner, the financial stimuli that have come to the clinical enterprise have not always have found a friendly home among the faculty in the U.S. medical school, whereas the others did. And I want to comment on that cultural disjunction as I go on with this in just a minute. Most people would feel that there are 4 stimuli that have really shaped the current clinical enterprise, and it's really necessary to know these to understand where we are at this point in time. I have drawn heavily on Paul Starr and his book, The Social Transformation of American Medicine. It was published in 1982, but it was prescient in its description of what might happen, so you can read what he guessed might happen in 1970, and in fact, all of it came to be, and it tells you where we are till about 1990. And I've also drawn on Kenneth Ludmere, who wrote the book Time to Heal, which was published in 1999. The first stimulus to the clinical enterprise was Medicare and Medicaid. And fundamentally, it offered a new source of reimbursement for a large group of people who fundamentally were not covered to this point. It basically, in the colloquial, put money on the table, more money than had ever been available for health care before. The next step that influenced all of us was the creation of new medical schools. The federal government decided in the 70s and 80s that they should increase the number of schools from 88 to 126 and increase the number of students graduating a year from 7,000 to about 15,000. Part of the reasoning was access, but part of the reasoning was to increase the supply of physicians as a way to force competition and reduce the cost of health care. Most people feel that there was the opposite effect, that in fact the creation of new physicians only increased demand and escalated the cost of health care. Into this arena came the for-profits and corporate America. Here's what they saw. They saw an increased number of physicians. They saw more money available for health care than ever before. They saw a growing and an aging population that was out there. They saw very few controls on the expenditures of health cares. In fact, we were paid at that time, hospitals and physicians, usual and customary, or basically what was cost plus payment. Figure out what you needed, add a little bit more money to it, and that was the payment. Community hospitals were run by well-meaning citizens, but with little or no background in healthcare delivery at the time. And physicians were organized or disorganized, as the case may be, into a cottage industry. Humana and the Hospital Corporation of America represent examples of corporate America that did successfully in this environment. Humana began as a nursing home in 1961. It started buying hospitals in 1972. Between 68 and 80, its revenues increased from $4.8 million to $1.4 billion. In 1993, it spun off its hospital corporation to Columbia HCA. And Columbia HCA proceeded to buy up more hospitals, owning the largest number of hospitals at one point in time of any company. Their strategy was pretty simple: to buy up hospitals and close poorly performing ones, leaving many communities in disarray, centralizing back office functions, settled in favorable zip codes, giving rise to a new jargon of cherry picking and adverse selection. And both of them have survived to the present time. Both of them, this not a misprint, had revenues in 2008 of $28 billion. There was public backlash. There were key TAM suits. There were fines and penalties over the denial of coverage or overcharging. I think the most dramatic one was a testimony by Linda Peeno, who was an employed Humana physician on denying a patient a heart transplant. She met before Congress and said, "I wish to begin by making a public confession. In the spring of '87, as a physician, I caused the death of a man. Although this was known by many people, I have not been taken before any court of law or called into account for this in any public forum. In fact, just the opposite occurred. I was rewarded for this. It brought me an improved reputation in my job and contributed to my advancement." The federal government investigated HCA for over 10 years and finally settled on a $1.7 billion settlement for overcharging and for denying care. And as I mentioned, the closure of rural hospitals weakened many communities and created an angry citizenship. Nevertheless, the entry of the for-profits in corporate America forever changed the practice of medicine for us as well. The first lesson learned from them was that if you could segregate out well-paying activities by zip code and procedure, one could make an enormous amount of money in healthcare. When healthcare was organized by community hospitals and in a cottage industry with physicians, there was an assumption within the community that they would make it all work out in the end. But when healthcare got organized across state lines with corporate headquarters a long way away, and people could cherry pick or could pick well-paying activities, the whole landscape of medicine changed. Any individual could now organize his or her life to make money or to improve his income. If you wanted to become wealthy, you could do high-pay activities like cardiovascular surgery in an environment in which the patients were insured. But it helped those who were under constant stress of salary as well. This is when family practice doctors began to do drug trials as a way to supplement income. And this is the time when psychiatrists moved to the pharmaceutical companies as a way to supplement their income. Before that occurred, there would always be discussion about whether or not medicine was a commodity or a calling. But somehow, ever since the end of the 70s and the 80s, as physicians began to adopt these methods as well, no longer was there any more discussion. They now become legitimized under the guise or under the statement of prudent business practices. So during this period of time, we saw a similar growth in academic health centers. From the time of the 60s, Medicare, Medicaid, up to 1990, academic health centers increased enormously in size. I think Ludmer in his book uses the term beefing up to explain the growth of medical schools. And it really did not bother us very much. It was not very difficult for us. And the reason why it wasn't very difficult for us was that it hadn't yet challenged our culture and the way we worked with each other. We just kept adding faculty, and this kept happening, and the cost of healthcare continued to increase. But things came to a bit of a halt when the insurance industry took it on themselves to try to bring down the cost of healthcare. And their change basically was a series of maneuvers, which we've come to call managed care, which proved not to be successful until they finally settled on the idea of negotiated price. So if you recall, the federal government got itself involved in healthcare in the 60s and 70s and decided it could bring down costs by increasing physicians and competition, and that experiment failed. About 1990, the U.S. auto industry was now complaining about the cost of healthcare and their uncompetitive advantage with Japanese automakers. And that led to what I'm going to call managed care, but those were efforts to deny access, basically. You remember the closed panel HMOs, the use of the primary care physician as a gatekeeper, and the financial incentives that physicians had to limit care. The testimony of Linda Peeno from before. These efforts failed because the public rebelled against this. But in the process, it led to finally negotiated price. You will recall in their attempts to limit access that the insurance companies created closed panels and then preferred provider organizations. And in that process, they slowly slipped from usual and customary charging to a negotiated price. Once negotiated price became the method for controlling healthcare costs, market share became the coin of the realm. You became as successful in healthcare now if you could negotiate with clout or with market share. So there was a tremendous competition for patients, a desire to build long strings of hospitals and patient groups, so-called horizontal integration. And among all those strategies, the one which has proved to work the best was the acquisition of hospitals to create a larger market share and a better position for negotiating. You will recall that we bought Rex Hospital. We also started looking at the way we did business because market share was so important. We wanted to attract particularly paying patients. The reason for the paying patients in our case was to offset the costs of doing our indigent care. So it became critical that our hospital have a successful paying patient clientele. And academic health centers all began to change the same way. They all of a sudden became interested in patient satisfaction. We never did patient satisfaction scores before. We got worried about waiting time. We developed marketing budgets and marketed our services. We focused on the remunerative services. We didn't ignore the others, but we focused on remunerative services. If you have any question about that, just try to walk out of an airplane at RDU today and tell me about all the leading heart centers that exist in this particular area. ECU, Wake Med, Duke. 2 or 3 times before you finally get to the carousel, you find out about these. And academic health centers also began to acquire hospitals. We acquired Rex. Duke has Raleigh Community and Durham Regional. Up until this move to competition and this attempt to compete in this environment by building market share, the faculty had been pretty okay with the way healthcare was going. But when we got into that, it started to create some clashes with their culture. And I'm going to take it up in a little bit later and deal with it in more detail now. But I want to use it as a segue and a reason to move into thinking about UNC's mission. Because many faculty felt we'd lost our heads and lost track of what our mission should be at that time. When I came here in 1997, I was really quite amazed by the results of a survey that I did. You may not recall, but when I got here, I asked the faculty to tell me what they thought we ought to look like if we were going to be the model medical school. We sent that out, we got answers back, we compiled the answers, and we turned them around into specific questions. People got to vote and so forth. And at the end of that process, the faculty of this school concluded that the top priority for a model medical school was to serve the people of the state. Now, I've been to 2 pretty good medical schools before, in Duke and at Emory, and I can almost guarantee you that would not have been the response at Duke or Emory. The response would have been probably to create the next generation of leaders or to advance knowledge. But to serve the people of the state, I'm almost positive, would not have arisen. That all goes back to our beginning, because from our inception, we were a value-driven institution. These are 2 of the billboards that went up with the Good Health movement when Berryhill and others were trying to move the school to a 4-year school and to create the North Carolina hospitals. And if you need further evidence, remember the chorus of complaints that erupted from the faculty when this plaque was not placed back on the walls of the hospital after the new hospital was built. The one that says we're operated by and for the people of North Carolina. A remarkable expression of our commitment to serve the people of the state. Since I've stepped down as dean, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of groups about a lot of different issues. And I have yet another surprise. The first surprise was the commitment to the state when I first arrived. The second surprise is how many people interpret that commitment to be so narrowly construed as providing uncompensated care. There's simply no reason to limit the meaning of serving the people of the state to providing indigent care. Our history doesn't support it. A sampling of legislators will not support it. Legislation passed in favor of the school does not support it. And nor does the faculty effort support such a narrow definition. So let's go back to the mission and look at it in evolution. So we started back in 1952, 1954, and there's no question that initially the mission of the school was indigent care, to care for all the people of the state of North Carolina, and to create doctors for the state for workforce issues. In 1970, however, it expanded with AHEC, and with AHEC, our mission evolved further to continuing education, workforce, including doctors, but other than doctors throughout the state, and the provision of services in specialty clinics throughout the state. AHEC grew up in 1972, but before that, we had expanded mission even further. In 1959, the Research Triangle was created. And in creating the Research Triangle, there was a confluence of many university leaders and business leaders to create the Research Triangle Park as a way to promote research and technology and economic development. So as early as 1959 and coming in full force in the 1970s, about the time when AHEC was developing, the Research Triangle Park expanded our mission to economic development as well. In my short history, the next expansion of the mission had to do with the creation of the healthcare system. I think it's going to become a seminal event in the history of the school, and not because it changed mission, but because it challenged the culture that existed here. And it reawakened the interest of the legislature in this place, which has resulted in a new definition in terms of how they think we're doing when we're doing well, and also in a spate of legislative financial support, which is unprecedented here and I think probably unprecedented anywhere in the country. So let's go back to the healthcare system and talk briefly about it. The movement to the healthcare system started before I got here. When I arrived in June, there was legislation that was passed to, quote, study UNC hospitals and to assess its readiness for the changes in healthcare. That passed in April of '97. It was sitting on President Broad's desk when she arrived in 1997 in July. She employed Larry Lewin, a respected consultant, to make recommendations to her, and it was he who really recommended the first time the idea of management flexibility, which meant that we had to be released from the state strictures with regard to human resources, purchasing, construction, and contracting. And the second element of his proposal was to have a single CEO so that we would have authority to make decisions. This decision by the legislature to move this way is really very important. Many people since, other universities within the UNC system, have attempted to get the kind of management flexibility that we got, unsuccessfully. And we were given that management flexibility because we were recognized as being different, as needing to be, in the vernacular at that time, nimble, able to make decisions quickly, and with the idea that we were going to need to be a competitive healthcare system who supported ourselves in large part while still carrying out our mission. It was an acknowledgement on the part of the legislature that we were not going to be a completely subsidized government entity, and that we were not going to become an indigent care satellite to nearby private agencies. This need to get competitive created some strains with the faculty. I use the word dystonic because I'm a psychiatrist. Most of you probably think that's a funny word, a neologism. Actually, it exists, okay? So in psychiatry, we talk about people who have personality disorders and people who are neurotic, okay? Neurotic people are anxious. So what that means is when they start acting in funny ways and things, they feel nervous about it and it makes them anxious. So we call that ego dystonic. So ego dystonic means you're anxious, okay? So we were culturally dystonic. We were culturally anxious, if you will. People with character disorders like sociopaths and so forth are not bothered by the behavior, so they exhibit no anxiety. So they're ego-syntonic, okay? So that's where these words come from, okay? So let's look at the challenge to the culture. The first change involved the role of the faculty. Now, historically, being a faculty member means that you're able to choose an area of inquiry and you're able to pursue it wherever it takes you. The model is probably the medieval artisan who's got a benefactor, lets the artisan do whatever he wants, claps and pleases and pays for it, and the artisan can do whatever he wants. That's kind of the pure fantasy of the faculty member. But starting in 1990, faculty found they were being hired for specific roles. That narrowed their potential scope of academic inquiry. The needs of the health system made it much more difficult to move back and forth between the lab and the clinic, creating more anxiety. 24/7 comprehensive coverage made it much more exacting. And all of this, along with new reforms with regard to documentation, contributed to a tremendous loss of autonomy on the part of the faculty. Some faculty were hired to provide clinical care only with little academic responsibilities, people who were on our clinical tracks. And for some of those members of the academy, they questioned whether that was really a violation of the role of the faculty. And Ludmere himself in his book said, "What is this? Are we going back to the proprietary age?" The second change was the relationship of the dean to the chair. Now, prior to the 1990s, the chair was the czar, okay? If one was a surgery chair or a medicine chair or an anesthesiology chair, one gazed within one's own eyes to determine what your department should be like. When I was a psychiatry chair, my vision of a psychiatry chair was my idea of what a good psychiatry chair looked like across the country, okay? And my job was to try to create that when I was at Emory, and likewise, that's how chairs looked on it. However, with the competition and the changes that occurred in the healthcare system, chairs moved from being czars to being middle managers in some ways, because now they were supposed to listen to the dean CEO and get what the health system needed. So who was determining how many anesthesiologists we need? Well, not the anesthesiology chair. The CEO and the hospital director were deciding how many anesthesiologists we need. And then they were deciding also how many of this and how many of that surgeon we needed and so forth. And so, whereas before there was kind of a pleasant relationship between the dean and the chair CEO, there became a much more confrontive relationship between them. And then the third was the use of metrics. As dean CEOs searched for ways to try to manage the place and make it efficient and make it work well, they caught onto this idea that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And they started putting measurements and metrics. So even if you got hired for a job, your job included, you're going to do this, and we're going to prove you did this by you accomplishing this, and the metrics and so forth. And so the place changed. The transition from the free-spirited artisan of the medieval time to the hired worker was entirely completed. The next thing about the evolution of the mission is that I think with the competition that came and with the creation of the healthcare system, we were kind of rediscovered by the legislature. Something happened in that time when we passed the legislation for the healthcare system and they gave us management flexibility, that they became much more interested in how we exercised it and what we did. They became much more interested in us. It reawakened their interest in us. Let me tell you just a brief. Holy smokes, it's 6:20. Okay. Whoa, okay. Take my word. I won't tell you the brief anecdote because it's long. Okay. Take my word that things changed. That legislators began to look at this hospital as their hospital and that they owned it. Okay. That's how they viewed it. This was no longer ours and give me a report, Roper, every 6 months. This was their hospital. Okay. I wish I could tell you the anecdote. Anyway. Tell you? Well, I got to skip something here. Okay, I'll tell you the anecdote because I think it's a good anecdote. So I got called down to the legislature at the end of the session by Senator Bass Knight to introduce for the first time the $180 million cancer hospital. Now, this was like at the end of the session, and it was like at the end of the day for these people. They wanted to get the session over. They wanted to get home, and I was about to ask them for $180 million, okay? In the room were the so-called leadership team. And these are important people. These are the committee chairs and some members of the House. I had never been before this austere group since I was called down there to talk about the healthcare system, okay? So I went down and I began a pitch for why we needed a new hospital. And I gave my pitch about why we needed it, and I'll shorten it. I won't tell you what all I told them, and why they had to pay for it and we couldn't pay for it, and why it was going to cost $180 million. And I got done. And I was trying to assess whether they had any interest at all in what I was talking about, okay? And I was picking up that it was the end of the day, and when does this end, and when do we get on to our next thing? I didn't feel like I was making a lot of progress, okay? So we went for that a while until one legislator interrupted the entire group and said, "How many of you have ever or have had a loved one who's been a patient in Gravely?" And about 3/4 of the people raised their hand. And I knew I was halfway home at that time. I mean, this was time to kind of stop talking and let this thing go for a while. So I stopped talking, and the whole conversation shifted from whether or not we needed it to, oh my God, this is another thing for Chapel Hill. What about my part of the state? Why don't we get something? Why does everything go to Chapel Hill? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then at that time, I believe it was Senator Rand, but somebody in a deep baritone voice piped up and said, this is not the Good Doctor's Hospital. This is not Chapel Hill's hospital. This is our hospital. And we were home. It got funded a year later, but we were pretty much home. And that's how they view it. When they view our hospital, they're looking at, is it clean? Does my doctor see me? Do I have to wait for things? Do things work or not? This is our hospital. And I think their reawakened interest in our hospital has also been responsible in part to the enormous amount of funding. Now, I want to go through this list, and I want to point out just the big R. One of the most amazing things to me was the dedication of the cancer hospital and all of our legislators standing up there and talking about research as part of patient care and as research being important in its own right as well as for economic development. I was just amazed. I can tell you that I went down there several times, and it wasn't until about 2002 or 2003 when Chancellor Measer and I went down there to defend the fact that we were buying gourmet pizzas with our indirects, if you remember. This was Pizzagate, another quick anecdote. The conservative elements of the legislature thought they ought to take the indirects back to the legislature. They called us down to ridicule us in public, to make the case that we obviously didn't need the money because we were using the money from the grants, from the indirects, to buy pizza, and not only pizza, but gourmet pizza. I think what happened is that in the course of that, they realized what a remarkable research enterprise this is, you know, and then rather than throttling it, maybe we ought to help this thing grow a little bit. But it wasn't until then, and now they talk with great fluency about research, and I think it's great. I don't know if it's that. Okay, the last thing I want to say is with evolution of mission, I believe that the state legislature has probably done a better job of operationalizing what it means to be the best public medical school than we ever did ourselves. What I hear them saying now is that the clinical care here has to be so good that you never have to leave the state. And the education and research has to be good as you can get anywhere. Okay? So you don't have to worry about your rankings. You just don't have to go to Hopkins or Mayo to get what you need. You got to get it here, and you got to get educated here as well as you can any place. Okay, we got a problem. Sense of community. All right. I believe that our sense of community is one of our greatest characteristics. It impressed me enormously when I first arrived here, and I've noticed it in people who we recruit here, how quickly they pick up to the idea of the collegiality that we have. And I think it expresses itself in a number of ways. One is in our centers. One is that we seem to have an inherent sense of trying to solve problems by enlarging the pie rather than by hoarding resources, which makes us different from almost every other medical school in the country. I think we work across campus to solve problems better than most. We don't do it always very well, but the Carolina Center for Genome Sciences is one good example. And I've noticed kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've noticed that we recruit people who pick up our sense of collegiality. They become our faculty members. They become incorporated into the culture, and they recruit other people here. So I think we've created a tremendous advantage here out of our sense of community. I would mention one downside, and I only mention it because before I am about to say what I'm going to say, I asked several faculty if they thought this was a fair statement. My observation is that the downside to collegiality is that sometimes we shun conflict and we accept the status quo, and we don't take on big problems because they're too big and they would disappoint too many people. And I would like to suggest, since it talks about what we're like when we're at our best, that we're at our best when we confront that and when we pursue excellence and we shun mediocrity. We can never let that happen and happen as an excuse of being collegial. We must find a way to be collegial and still pursue excellence all the time. We're at our best when we're talking about science. We're at our best when we're talking about innovative clinical programs. We're at our best when we're not afraid of the obstacles that we might come up against and we're prepared to go after it. Okay. I'm going to try to tie this up. We'll see how we go. We're down to now the implications of all this for today's realities. I'm going to take up where we started today, you recall I made comments about Rick Boucher and Spencer and Pisano. You recall that. They all had to do with industry relations. The point that I want to make, I've already stated. I believe it's in our mission to work with industry to create translational activities, and I think we should be trying to work with industry to create products. I know there's a tremendous interest out there in conflicts of interest at this time, and I think we have to admit that the public trust has been hurt enormously by it. And the steps must be taken to restore that trust. And the disclosure and management of these issues is essential. But I would urge us not to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. An easy solution is to create administrative bottlenecks where nothing happens. I would hope we would avoid that. I'd be prepared even to make another mistake or two along the way before we get it right. But I think we ought to try to get it right. And we ought to encourage the relationship of this university with products that are developed and produced in industry. The second group has to do with the clinical enterprise. My view of that is this. Every one of those vignettes that I gave you could be viewed from an economic point of view. Every one of those also absolutely has to do with our mission and meeting our mission. And every one of them also represents an area of interpersonal and intrapersonal unease or anxiety. All three of those exist at the same time. In my new life as a coach and running the program in leadership development, I work with a number of people, we'll call them mid-career people, who run clinical programs and deal with this day in and day out. And their question to me is, how do I deal with these when they're all conflicting and when they're there and with faculty are so anxious? How do I deal with this? And I've come up with just three things. They're not very elegant, but this is what I tell them, and I'll share it with you. One is to determine the unease that you're hearing about, determine whether or not it's background noise or it really requires an intervention, okay? I learned this when I was a faculty member at Duke. I had a wonderful mentor in Keith Brody. I recall an occasion when I advised him how he might do his job better, and I recall his response to me to go back to my research, my clinical care, and my teaching. And it was the best advice I ever gave, and I took his advice, and I went back to my knitting, so to speak. There's a lot of unease and distrust. There's a lot of background noise that exists all the time. The first step is trying to figure out if it really requires an intervention or is part and parcel of what we're doing in our work. I think at the current time, I kind of hate to rush like this, but anyway, I'm trying to. Anyway, at the current time, I think there's a difference, at least in degree, if not in nature, about some of the things. I'm just amazed at what's happened to the whole issue of documentation. I mean, the medical chart used to be a chart that explained what we did to a patient, and so somebody could pick up the care and continue the care of the patient. Now the chart has to meet all sorts of compliance standards. Now the chart has to be okay, be audited by the insurance company. I mean, the chart is turned around. I mean, it's just a mess. A friend of mine told me they went to see their physician the other day in a clinic, and the physician never faced him. The physician sat down at his computer with his back to the patient, asking questions over his shoulder, filling out his computer, and never once looked in the face of the patient during the whole course of the interview. Well, I'm sure he got everything documented in the chart, and I'm sure the insurance companies are happy, but this is hardly an acceptable state of affairs for where we are at this time. And my point in saying that is this is an area that needs an intervention. I don't know exactly what the intervention is, but it needs an intervention. I think it's affected patient care. I think it's affected teaching. It's gotten out of hand. I'm hopeful that in the healthcare reform, we might get to a single insurance form, that we might actually have easy-to-use information systems, and we might actually use them to reduce work rather than to create work. As I was preparing my talk, I asked Dr. Andrew Gagani, when he called me one night at 9:30 to check up on me, how he coped with all of this. And he said, and I think it's instructive, he says, well, I love working with the people, and when you get right down to it, it's a privilege to be a doctor. That leads me to my third point. people work for different things. There's multiple reward systems. I get worried when we keep trying to drive this train with only financial incentives, that somehow that's going to make it. But that seems to be the only tool in the toolbox at times, the only way we want to kind of turn things around. People are motivated about a lot of things more than just by money. They're motivated to a whole lot in this place if they can get an academic career out of all the things that they're doing. And so if they can be given a situation where that's made more possible, they're going to be happy. People have families, they have obligations to their family and to child care and so forth. If that can be accommodated, that's going to help them. So when I deal with these people, I tell them those things. Separate out the background noise. If you need to, go ahead and make an intervention. And just remind people are motivated by more than one thing. So let me pull this together and close. I've been asked since I've been dean and I've stepped down by trustees and others, in my opinion, what does UNC need to do to become an even greater institution? And my reply is always the same. First of all, don't lose what makes you great. You have a culture that puts others' interests above one's own. And this is seen in your commitment to serve people and the sense of collegiality that we enjoy here, that celebrates the accomplishments of others. I know this is considered soft stuff by most people, but you can't buy this stuff, and you're not going to be ever able to create it in a lot of other prestigious universities, ever. It's not going to be possible to create the sense of culture that we have here. Our institution's commitment to the public good is huge. The fact that we all hold it is huge. And it determines our position in many areas of policy. Consider this poor man, okay? What would it be like for him and his job if when he met with the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry and the AMA and all the others that he meets with, if their first interest was the public good? I mean, how would his job be changed? It would be huge, right? I mean, is the public good not served by everyone being covered? By no loss of coverage for pre-existing illness? I happen to believe to get there you need the individual mandate. And I also believe the public good is served by the lower cost of health care. What if, in fact, the people around the table actually believed that and wanted to work that way? I'm going to end with this. I asked Gene Oringer to read my talk, and he came back and he asked me a few questions. Among them was, well, do you really believe that institutions have personalities? And if you do, how fragile are these personalities? Do they just fall apart or do they hold themselves together? And I would answer it this way. I think institutions have a certain character, and I think they have a culture. And I think this culture is held together by a certain set of values. And I think those values are commonly accepted by the group. And when people behave within these values, it's viewed as okay kind of behavior. And when they don't behave according to those values, they're viewed as kind of weird and something's kind of wrong with them. And people tend to conform to the values of the group. So the group tends to indoctrinate people and bring people along, and people begin to behave the same way and talk the same way in these institutions. However, Gardner points out in his book on leadership that values always decay over time, and that societies that keep their values alive don't do that by escaping decay, but by processes of regeneration. And he goes on to say that every generation must rediscover the living elements of its own tradition and adapt to present realities. And so to the question of fragility, I say, it's not fragile if these processes can be rediscovered each generation by the people in the institution. So it's our job, post-Berryhill, to develop that for us, and it's the job of those coming along to continue that tradition. Now, unfortunately, Gardner doesn't tell us how to do that. So in these courses that I run, I've been asking these faculty, so how do you regenerate values? How do you do that? And I've come to a rather inelegant and simple solution to this, and that is that you say it, okay? So what I mean is this. Most books on leadership will tell you it's a job of the leader to reinforce the values and to fight off the bad values and to keep people focused. And that's a job of leadership. But in the academic community, it's also the job of the faculty. If the legislature believe they own the hospital, you own the culture of the institution, and you're responsible that culture remain intact. And so the way you do it, only way I can think of that's so simple is that when things are put forward as things to do as a group, you say, you know, that might be hard for us, but that's really in keeping with what we are as an institution. That's what it means to serve the people of the state. We need to do that. You reiterate the values. You say that. If something comes out that sounds like it's askew from that, you say, hey, I'm not sure that that fits the values that we're about in this institution. So it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy, but we need to do that. There's a little bit of politeness in our conversation at times, and so people often want to sit on their hands and let somebody else be the first person to talk. But I'm encouraging you to speak up because it's important that we keep this culture going at this point. So here we are. Today's realities are a highly commoditized marketplace and a world absorbed with self-interest. The antidote to a commoditized marketplace is an orientation that seeks the public good. And the antidote to self-interest is a culture that celebrates others doing well. We've had these from the beginning. So the question is where we started. Is our commitment to serve the state and sense of community relevant in today's reality? You bet. In fact, they're essential, more today than ever. If we keep our mission to serve the people of the state, we'll always have a focus and a direction, and if we keep our community, we'll always be happy doing it. Thank you very much.
Jeff, I think you can tell by people's enthusiasm and their attention that we deeply appreciate your own commitment to this service and community spirit that embodies this place in a very special way. Thank you. Thank you so much for what you've done and what you continue to do. Let me acknowledge Corrine Houpt. She's the person who enables Jeff to do what he has just done. Corrine, would you stand up so we can recognize you, please? And I hope you've already gotten, but if you haven't yet, please outside on the table get your complimentary copy of the second volume of the Norma Berryhill lecture series, which have just been published thanks to the efforts of Dr. Bill McClendon. Bill, thank you, and Dr. Liz Dreesen for editing this volume. It's a remarkable compilation of what others have said about this very special place. We now have a reception prepared for you. Please linger and enjoy. Talk with Jeff and enjoy the things that make it such a special community here. Good evening. Thank you, everyone.